Welcome to Books and Ideas. My name is Ron King. In this video, I discuss the book Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know by Adam Grant. There are two parts to the agenda. In the setup part, we talk about the author, foundational terms, and then I list the book chapters and parts and position the book in the life insights literature. In terms of topics, I pick 8 different topics that I think are really most interesting that the author presents. The unifying theme of these topics is how our capabilities and our confidence matches. And we'll see that the author talks about these from a personal level, from a convincing others level, and from a work point of view. The author is maybe a quintessential modern business school faculty member. He's a professor of organizational psychology at the Wharton School at UPenn. He's a great teacher, very impactful researcher. He's a thought leader. He's got work-life podcasts, and I strongly recommend that podcast. Quite interesting. He's got a newsletter. He works as a consultant. He's a business owner. And this book, Think Again, is the 4th book. All of really solid books. I particularly like this Think Again book, but all of his books are very good. Again, really a fine example of a modern business school faculty member. So rethinking is his topic, and we could think about rethinking as something where we re-examine our beliefs and opinions, but we can approach it 2 different ways. One is a more local approach, change your mind on a particular matter, like I might change my mind on a career path I'm on. The second is a much more broad concept. It's change your mindset. And a mindset can be defined as a lens or a filter through which you see the world, how the world is perceived, and how information is organized and interpreted. So when we change our mindset about rethinking, it basically asks us to think about all those aspects of life or our experiences and look at them with a new eye. And the idea is that mindset change is a fundamental concept for change in general. So we don't think about this as a skill for changing one aspect, but the whole approach we have to decide, do we stay the course or pivot? And this mentality, this mindset, affects what one pays attention to. The author gives several rationales for why this rethinking should be something of concern. And the first is what he calls the first instinct fallacy. And what he reports is that the research is pretty solid that test takers, on average, when they change their answer by erasing and putting a different answer, move to a correct answer. And he characterizes this as a misunderstood concept. And I have to say, I fell in this category, always thinking that if you, on a standardized exam, have your first instinct, stick with that because you're generally right. And he said that's not true at all, that generally people who rethink a question, erase and change it to another one, move in the right direction. Other evidence he points to about why rethinking is a very useful concept is that the best forecasters, whether market forecasters, weather forecasters, political forecasters, there's a correlation between how often you change your mind and your accuracy. He then gives a couple examples where people didn't change their mind. And again, more of the local thing, their mind, as opposed to their mindset. Talks about Albert Einstein resisting to quantum mechanics. Of course, Albert Einstein was a very influential model in developing the general theory of relativity. He initiated that, but he never got comfortable with quantum mechanics, the theory of the small. Mike Lazaridis, the BlackBerry founder and CEO, he really was very resistant to moving from the technology that made him successful to the next generation, and it ended in the bankruptcy of the company. Steve Jobs, many people talk about Steve as being a very influential, forward-looking person. But he makes the case that Steve didn't want to move into the mobile phone device, but it was only his managers, his fellow leaders in Apple that convinced him to move in that direction. Of course, it was a tremendous positive thing for Apple. And so the overall rationale and the anecdotes leads to the conclusion the author has that by adopting a rethinking mindset, we have a better life. I'd like to give a quick overview of what the chapters are and what the parts of the book. So he starts with part 1, individual rethinking, moving our own opinions. So there's 4 chapters, and we're going to pick 3 of these chapters to highlight one of the concepts. The second part is opening other people's minds. He talks about debate and use of persuasion. Then he talks about collective rethinking, working in a community of lifelong learners. And this, in some sense, connects with work and education. And then in part 4, the conclusions. And in the epilogue, he gives 30 different highlights, and I'd like to spend a minute on 3 of those. So this slide here shows the way I think about the concepts related to the life insight literature. And I put it in 9 categories. These are somewhat arbitrary. They are not mutually exclusive or exhaustive. But I think about number 5, the world view and beliefs, is sort of the executive functioning. It's our inner dictator about how we see the world. And this is where we process what we believe about ourselves. Number 4, our identity, our goals, based on 1, 2, and 3, which is our kind of starting point, the machinery we have for our brain and body, the social setting, and sort of the circumstance, the luck we have. And the JDM is judgment, decision making, and what we do. It's the outcomes, that is, whether we get promoted, whether we have successful projects. And then 9 is how do we interpret them. And this literature, the life insight literature, talks a lot about happiness and fulfillment. And I use these 9 categories to sort of think about how books fall in these categories and how they relate. And think again is one that falls here in the worldview. It's a mindset. Another book, Mindset by Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth, Grit, are books I see sort of in the same area. But Adam says that we want to understand that grit, for example, is where we persevere. And his book is, well, maybe we shouldn't persevere all the time, that sometimes we should quit rather than continuing to grit. Let's start with a highlight from the first chapter called A Preacher, a Prosecutor, a Politician, and a Scientist Walk into a Bar. I might mention the author's got a nice sense of humor. I really appreciate the way he sometimes turns the phrase and connects his points of view with sort of humorous anecdotes. So Phil Tetlock, someone who's influenced him, said there's the mindset of 3 professions. One is a preacher, where your job is to convey confidence that we're right, and you persuade others to that point of view. And this mindset is one that the more you preach, the stronger your beliefs, that you sort of drink your own Kool-Aid. A prosecutor is someone where you're trying to prove someone else is wrong. A politician is trying to win the approval of our audience. And he's saying all of these elements are common in life, and in each of us engage in these different tracks. But he said if we want to be good at changing our mind and having the mindset for rethinking, we should think like a scientist and use the element of the scientific process, where we set up hypotheses and look for reasons why we might be wrong, not only why we might be right. And he said why we tend not to be able to rethink if we're a preacher is because by changing our mind, it indicates a moral weakness. If we've got this sort of element of preaching that we're right and we're trying to convince others to follow. A prosecutor, if you change your mind, you're admitting defeat. If you're a politician, you become a flip-flopper. But he said we really should think about it as a scientist, where We change due to intellectual integrity. We take steps towards the truth that shape sharper logic using stronger data. So let's look at one of his slides. This came from page 28 of his book, and he talks about the rethinking cycle and the overconfidence cycle. And he wants to move us to the rethinking. And if we look at the overconfidence cycle, that if we've got pride in what we do and conviction, we look for confirmation and we end up with biases that make us see only part of the picture. And this cycle is somewhat problematic because as we look for things that confirm our beliefs, it gets validated, our pride goes up, our conviction gets stronger. And this can lead to the escalation of commitment where we invest beyond where we really should. And many of us know the concept of the sunk cost fallacy, where we continue to invest even though the evidence suggests that it might be worthwhile to reconsider whether we might pivot. So the mindset of a rethinker really affects where you focus your attention. So an overconfidence cycle is you focus to find evidence to support a mindset, thinking like a scientist, broadens that perspective so you focus more on the data to make the best decision. So the next thing I want to talk about is the armchair quarterback and the imposter. Use the word imposter to suggest where we have skills greater than what we represent. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is one that's well known. And you can see on this chart that on the horizontal, we have knowledge of a topic. So example, I could say, what is my knowledge of accounting? And then on the vertical, willingness to opine or strength of my beliefs about my knowledge there. So on the horizontal is what I actually know, and on the vertical is how I reveal how much I actually know. And he points out that when we know a little bit, when our knowledge goes from basically zero to a small amount, we increase disproportionately our willingness to opine or our confidence that we know something about this field. And he calls this, or this is known as Mount Stupid. And this is a really important point because sometimes people with very little expertise come across as being very confident that they have great expertise. And here's another graph not listed or not given in the book, but it has the same Dunning-Kruger diagram. But you see, after the peak of Mount Stupid, you fall off to the valley of despair. And this Dunning-Kruger effect shows that sometimes people know a little bit, they indicate great confidence, and then they get corrected or they get somewhat put back in their place. And then they go to this valley of despair and say, you know what, there's so much to learn, I'm going to give up. And then sometimes people get trapped in this valley of despair. They first get very confident, then they get very unconfident about their capabilities, and they give up. And really, sometimes we as instructors and as individuals who are trying to mentor others, help people out of that valley of despair, move them to what's called the slope of enlightenment, and then the plateau of sustainability. The Dunning-Kruger effect is really a cool idea. Obviously, it's oversimplified, but it does have a real universal truth. So again, we want to make sure that we don't fall victim to Mount Stupid or the valley of despair. So the next thing I'd like to do is talk about a graph that he provides on page 49 in the book, where he lists competency as a horizontal and confidence on the vertical. And if those are equal, that our competence and our confidence are equal, we have a 45-degree line. And if we're up in the upper northwest category, this is the armchair quarterback syndrome, where we're more confident than we actually have competence. And if we're down on the southeast corner, this is the imposter syndrome, where your competence is high, but your confidence is low. And this is where you say, I'm an imposter. I am not capable of doing what is expected of me. So he said we don't want to be in either of those. What we'd like to do is be in the confident humility zone, which is a little bit below our actual capabilities, that our confidence is somewhat moved in a way where we tend to be more competent than we express in our confidence. So this is the area where he said that we can make our greatest strides forward. So going back to the list of the chapters, let's look at chapter 4, the Good Fight Club. And this, I think, is one of the most interesting aspects of the book, where he contrasts low-performing groups with high-performing groups. And in the low-performing groups, we see on the horizontal time and on the vertical axis the amount of conflict. And there are two types of conflict that are graphed here: relationship conflict and total conflict, or excuse me, task conflict. And when we compare low-performing groups with high-performing groups, what we see is that high-performing groups has low relationship conflict, but high task conflict. And he uses the example of Wilbur and Orville Wright, who were the originators, or one of the, given credit for the first air flight. And for many years, they were trying to figure out how we could develop the optimal propeller. And as you would well guess, when you have a propeller and there's a single propeller, there's great torque on the wings, because as a propeller turns, it torques the plane, so it's very unstable. So they spend a great deal of time trying to develop an optimal propeller. And they argued, apparently historical anecdotes are very clear that they argued strenuously about the tasks, about the ideas. But then at night would go home and be friends and enjoy dinner and social. And next day they would show up as partners, but again, have a great deal of task conflict in terms of what's the right answer. In terms of propeller, it was interesting when they finally solved it. The way it was solved was that you would have two propellers, each going in different direction, which adds stability to the early plane as they were developing the rest of the aerodynamics. So I think this is a really exceptional part of the book. I'd like to now look at chapter 9, rewriting the textbook, teaching students to question knowledge. I think it's true about students, but I think it's true about all of us. And he characterizes this on page 201 of the book: judging yourself or judging your work. And I think this is really important, particularly for people who tend to suffer a bit from the imposter syndrome, that when you come up with an idea and you say, I'm a genius, versus this idea is genius, and as you work through, you end up at different places. If you start with saying, I'm a genius, and then you write a rough draft or you come up with your first idea, many cases, those initial ideas are not great. And you might react by saying, I might be the worst writer of all time. Whereas if you have an idea, you say, this might be the worst draft of all time. This idea, my work is not great. And the implications here is, if you think you're the worst writer, you give up. Where if you think your work needs improvement, you rewrite it. So I think this is a good way to think. And many of us, in many cases in society, we find that there is a distinction again between the task, what you do, versus the person of who you are. And that many times our identity gets wrapped up in our work. And this can really cause people to second guess. So when you rethink things, you want to make sure you rethink them in the right way, that you don't give up too soon. Let's jump to chapter 10. That's not the way we've always done it, building on the culture. And this is the idea of psychological safety. In a previous slide, I mentioned that you want to promote task conflict, but not relationship conflict. And the question of how to do that is, in some sense, addressed by this psychological safety. You want people who work with you or work for you to see mistakes as an opportunity to learn. That's the mindset you want to promote in your business, in your enterprise, rather than to see mistakes as threats. So if you want to have your coworkers be at high task conflict, where they disagree, where they not threaten, but where they challenge each other, but yet don't take it personally, you need to have this psychological safety. And most importantly, see mistakes as not something negative, but as a path for learning. This is on page 210 of the book, so you can check this out when you have time. Let's jump to the epilogue. Again, there are many concepts in the book. I think this book is just solid, full of good ideas. But in this video, just want to hit a few of the highlights. On the epilogue, he talks about 30 different things that you might consider doing as action for impact. And this is on page 251 to 257. And in part one, where he discusses individual rethinking, he suggests build a challenge network, not just a support network. And I think this is really important. Surround yourself with the right people. And I would add, in addition to a challenge network, an energy network, people who are doing things. Because again, if you can maintain this high level of psychological safety and task conflict where you challenge each other, that puts us on a path for rethinking. And again, he's got many other really important things here. I'm just going to pick a couple of these. And the second part, where he talked about asking better questions, become a better listener. And I think many times people who are in this overconfidence thing really don't want to listen to what others have to say. So I think persuasive listening is a very powerful thing. He also has other good things. I'm picking just a few of these, but really I encourage you to take a look at these pages in the book. And finally, for the collective rethinking, schedule a life checkup. And I'm really a big believer in metrics and setting periodic times to rethink. And a rethinking is where you step back and you say, I have been on a path for certain life choices, whether it's career or family or interest. Schedule a time systematically to say, let's look at this again. Let's rethink. Let's have a mindset of rethinking. So in this video, we first went through some setup issues. We positioned this book in the life insights literature as the worldview point of view. And then we went through 8 different topics. I cherry picked the topics. Overall, I highly recommend this book. I think there's a lot to learn here. And really the way to get the most out of this book is, as you read it, talk to others. I'm a big believer, if you want to develop an expertise in a domain, learn the language, use the language, try to teach, try to talk to others about this, and really develop your capabilities. So this is Ron King signing out. Happy adventures.